Hello, I'm Cherian George. On behalf of my colleagues here at the School of Communication, Hong Kong Baptist University, and our co-organizers at the Chinese University of Hong Kong's School of Journalism and Communication, welcome to our panel discussion. Over the past 12 months, Hong Kong has experienced a series of unprecedented jolts to its media system. A new national security law took effect on 30th June last year. It is the first piece of legislation that the central government has grafted directly onto Hong Kong's legal framework since Britain returned the territory to China in 1997, and the first to allow Beijing to bypass Hong Kong courts and extradite the suspect to the mainland. The authorities have stated repeatedly that NSL is designed only for a small number of individuals committing the very serious offenses of secession, subversion, collusion with foreign forces, or terrorism. They say that criticism of the government would not constitute an offense and that Hong Kong's press freedoms would remain intact. Article 4 of the NSL states explicitly that, quote, the rights and freedoms, including freedom of speech, of the press, of publication, unquote, that residents enjoy under the territory's basic law and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, of which China is a signatory, shall be protected. But although the authorities' stated ends are to counter rare and extreme offenses, their chosen means are not particularly reassuring. The NSL is a broadly worded piece of legislation that threatens punishment that ICCPR experts say are not proportionate or necessary for the stated ends. Aside from the NSL, other legal and administrative tools have been used in much sharper ways than what our media are accustomed to. As a result, the city's most popular newspaper, Apple Daily, says it may run out of cash within weeks. Today there are even news reports revising its life expectancy to a matter of days. Meanwhile, below the radar, the public broadcaster, RTHK, is in the midst of a major transformation. In this session, we will not have the time to recap all the moves that have taken place over the past year, or even to catch up with today's news. Viewers who need a quick rundown can refer to a handout that we prepared. If you're watching this live on Zoom, I'll post the handout in the chat. If you're watching this later on YouTube, look for the link below this window or on the event website. Many members of our audience sent us questions before the event, and I'm sure we can look forward to others via Zoom's Q&A window. We don't promise that we'll be able to answer each individual question, but we will try to capture the main themes that are raised. I do want to highlight one question we received. The title of our event is Hong Kong Media Freedom Post-NSL. And Eric Poon from CUHK asks very simply, is there media freedom under NSL? He couldn't add any emojis, so I can't tell if this was meant to be ironic. Whatever the case, I'm sure Eric will forgive us if this panel doesn't have a simple yes or no answer to that question. We aim instead to explore the nuances of the Hong Kong media environment, highlighting not only what's clear, but also contradictions and uncertainties. To do this, we've gathered some of the sharpest scholars of media and politics in Hong Kong. I should emphasize that all of our speakers were on our A list. We did not need a plan B because all five agreed immediately to participate, which I think speaks to their commitment as scholars to public discourse around a topic that we deeply care about. We also have in the room representatives of media organizations, including the Hong Kong Journalists Association, the Foreign Correspondents Club, other working journalists, whom we hope to hear from during our Q&A. And I'm grateful to have as my co-moderator, my colleague in the journalism department of HKBU, Dr. Janet Loh. Janet will introduce our panel and get things going.
We are very happy that we can have our panel member to come here and share their views on the recent events and what's happening in Hong Kong now. So let me introduce them from the left. First is the Associate Professor Edmund Chen, is a political scientist at the Department of Public Policy, City University of Hong Kong. The second one is the Associate Professor King Fu is an internet scholar at the Journalism and Media Study Center of Hong Kong University. And then we come from Professor Francis Lee is a scholar of journalism and political communications at the School of Journalism and Communications, Chinese University of Hong Kong. And Dr. Rose research international journalism and political communications at the Department of Journalism here at HKBU. And Associate Professor Marco is a political communication scholar at the Department of Media and Communication, City University of Hong Kong. Let's give our big clap to them. Thank you for coming to Hong Kong Baptist Youth to share your view. Maybe we can start with Marco. We have read the headlines. We know that now Hong Kong has been falling in press freedom rankings. So, in your opinion, is that the end of the story? And take a step back from the daily news, is there any patterns that we have to pay closer attention to?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for organizing this. Every time I get invited to the chair, and I'm very happy to respond. I did have to change the job in country a couple times, but it comes with the territory, so good luck to us. What I want to say is that this is obviously an enormous kind of event for Hong Kong, and unfortunately probably not very unexpected, but we also have to see kind of the big picture, which is that we have a situation in which the largest social media platforms in the world ban the US president from speech as well. So if someone told you, if someone told you 3 years ago that President of the United States will not be allowed to use Twitter and Facebook, you would probably not even consider this as an option. So and there's a general trend in the world of erosion of press and media freedoms, even in those countries where legislatively this press freedom has not been intact. So, in most countries that I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar with a couple, there's general erosion of press and media freedom. So I don't think this is countering this trend in any possible way. With that said, I do see the law as the framers originally thought of it as probably trying to punish very few, whereas the impact of it should be much broader, particularly in terms of fostering self-censorship. One of the ideas that we really need to think about is that the real aim is very fundamental reframing of discourse on China and rewriting of specific narratives that talk about Hong Kong-China relationship, etc. I'm not a journalist, but one of the first things that I was trying to do these days is to figure out what are the as they say in Singapore, OB markers, south-to-bound markers. So what are the topics, for instance, that I'm free to speak about? I'll give you some examples of topics that could potentially offend, but maybe they are okay. So what if you discuss, let's say, a Belt and Road, for instance? What if you discuss someone else discussing China? So, the differences between advocacy and reportage. I can see a lot of interesting questions here, and I can see a lot of work that needs to be done by, I think, journalists and associations here to really demonstrate that press freedom is still preserved. We don't have many good examples in the region, unfortunately, but we have to, I guess, be very creative and I think very proactive. So,
Yeah, thanks for the response. And Rose, you have interviewed many journalists here about changing environment here. So, do you have any insight you can share with us, or what is the overall picture you see through their eyes?
Yeah, I think after the enact of the NSL, for the working journalists, the instant responses, what would be the impact on our daily operation, right? So especially on the journalistic practice, every daily practice. For example, it's about the content production, produce content. Hong Kong always seemed to be a very free society. Any contents deemed to be sensitive or forbidden in mainland China, you can do it here. But after NSL, it seems like a question mark, a big question mark there. there's no specific definition about sedition or the separation of advocacy of separate Hong Kong independence. But the thing is how to interpret that seems only the authority have the power to interpret how to define those content. And Apple Daily do provide an example that is reporting maybe because they didn't provide a lot of detail, but they do mention because of the articles, it might be the reporting, might be the columns, might be the editorial articles, not sure. But the thing is, for example, before journalists here in Hong Kong, you can do interview dissidents, which would not be able to be heard in mainland China. But you will be very free to do it here. So you heard a lot of stories about criticism CCP in Hong Kong, in Hong Kong media. Or you can, everyone can remember the collaboration of Panama paper. It's related to leaders, the top leaders of scandal, right? So before it seems very, it's the norm of the journalists here in Hong Kong, it's their job. But now, whether to be allowed to do that or without causing a lot of trouble, because in mainland China, that would definitely deemed to the state secret, national secret, right? So whether they will be included into the NSL, no one knows. And also, I think the journalistic material, it seemed to be the basic, it's the basic foundation of the press freedom here in Hong Kong used to be considered. But now, after the Apple Daily cases, you started to think about whether NSL can be the excuse to do anything. To get rid of this kind of protection of journalistic sources. And another thing I think for a lot of journalists, I asked them whether they're going to still working for certain media outlets. For example, Apple Daily, now it's became the reality, but before just ask them whether you're going to still working for Apple Daily. Because as you know, if you're working for a certain media outlets which has been targeted as not a pure media outlet, seems like labeled as the political organization or with so whether the staffs, especially journalists, will have some consequences. As we can see before the NSL, after the handover, journalists working for certain media outlets already have to bear a lot of consequences. For example, journalists working for Apple Daily, they already be prepared. They will not be hired. They will not be find another job in other newspapers. So yeah, those are the things which are raise a lot of concern before and especially after the NSL. Yeah.
Thanks, Rose. I think Marco and Rose have already raised points that need sort of deeper exploration. But before we address those, can we take a step back and try and figure out what the larger stage is? Because of course, media policy needs to be read in the broader context of political governance. So what's the new game? What's the new paradigm, if there is any? Francis, could you shed some light on that?
Sharon, you talk about, your question is, what's the new paradigm? I guess at this moment it's much easier to talk about what was the old paradigm than talk about what will be the new paradigm, right? So I guess, what happened in the past year signified a change, indeed, in the kind of, so-called paradigm of, governance of Hong Kong. Not just the media, but actually, the whole, how Hong Kong is being governed, how Hong Kong operates in general. For me, actually, these days I'm writing something with two of my colleagues, and we are talking about trying to frame our analysis of the change of Hong Kong media in terms of a paradigm shift from what we call integration under liberal exceptionalism. So basically what we said is that what we're trying to argue is that between 1997 and 2019, we call that period integration under liberal exceptionalism. So on the one hand, you have integration. You indeed have the Chinese government trying to exert more and more control of the Hong Kong society and politics in general. So, and of course, in the case of the press, we also know that Hong Kong press freedom has, in terms of the ranking in Reporters Without Borders or international ranking, Hong Kong has been declining the ranking, right, from about 18 to 20 in the early 2000s to like by 2017-18 was already like 70 something 80. So there was this period of integration, but at the same time, there was this counterbalance force that we summarize under the notion of liberal exceptionalism. In those 2 decades, Hong Kong, after all, did constitute some kind of an exception, if you consider that within Chinese soil, right? So Fa Lun Gong was not outlawed, right? Ji Hui was allowed to exist. People were allowed to, shout slogans like "Any one party rule," these kind of slogans, right? So there was indeed a case that, Hong Kong had this exceptional degree of freedom. And also in public culture, the values like core values like democracy and press and freedom have their hegemonic status. Even the Hong Kong government had to pay lip service, at least lip service. Okay, they might or might not actually trust that, but at least they have to say, okay, we value democracy, we value freedom. So this is this kind of liberal exceptionalism is the basis for the press, is the basis for journalists, for media organizations to push back. So basically, between 1997 and 2019, the kind of dynamic struggle for press freedom often is basically the clash between these two forces: the force of continual intervention and the force of pushing back. And the possibility of pushing back was grounded in that condition of liberal exceptionalism. Now, after 2019-2020, what we are seeing, especially in the past 12 months, is that there is apparently a paradigm change. A paradigm change in the sense that if you actually look at how Hong Kong government officials or the pro-establishment people these days are talking, they indeed no longer even pay lip service to democracy and freedom, right? They start saying that, you look at the United States, democracy is a bad idea. It's just stupid, right? They have this, in mainland China, they call this institutional self-confidence, right? Okay, so they are actually, changing that. They no longer so much value professionalism and procedure. Okay, in the past, there was a sense that Hong Kong, no matter what, you still have to respect professionalism. You have to respect procedures. You look at how the civil service is running, how different, sectors are running. But these days, especially in the past 12 months, you see that in Hong Kong at large, there seems to be a much less degree of respect for professionalism and procedure. And that applies not only to the media, but to, for example, educational sector, for a lot of other sectors. So it seems like, this is really moving away from the existing paradigm. And then, of course, in the past 12 months, we see one very important trend is that the very systematic use or very systematic change of the legal framework for controlling or for managing the press. That included all the changes regarding the various kinds of registries, okay, like the company search, like the company search, that kind of changes that include the use of laws, and not necessarily just the NSL, but also other laws like Bao Choi was arrested and convicted for false declaration. These are just the use of various kinds of legal means to control the press. So I think what happened in the past 12 months is a move away from the earlier paradigm. But it's actually hard to say what the new paradigm is, because presumably, I believe that there needs to be, they need to arrive at a new equilibrium, so to speak. Okay, this cannot go on forever, but it would be hard for anyone to predict at this point what the new equilibrium will look like. It's like stop my openings here.
Thanks, Francis. I think it's certainly clear that Hong Kong is becoming less of an exception. Although it's interesting that even over the last week or so, you still find officials claiming that no, what's happening really has no bearing on press freedom, which suggests that the kind of hegemonic strength that these values still have some cachet. It's not completely gone, and they still feel some need to claim that what's happening to Apple Daily, for example, is an exception to the rule, right? And the rule still is press freedom. It's kind of wearing thin, and I'd like to get your views on that later. But I think this point that you've made about is to what extent is Hong Kong still viewed by officialdom as an exception to be held up? Clearly something we want to discuss more later. But one way in which Hong Kong surely is exceptional is in internet governance, right? One of the biggest differences between Hong Kong and the rest of China is that although we are on Chinese soil, we are not behind the Great Firewall. And I'd like to ask King Hua, are there signs that we could be, or is that the direction we're heading?
First of all, thanks for having me today. Unfortunately, to answer the question, I think is yes, we already see the signals from around that basically now we are becoming adopting some form of kind of regulation in China. So, okay, maybe we step back a bit, just look at what exactly inside the NSL that concerning about internet. So I think one of the key, most important articles is Article number 9, which is the part that the government shall provide public communication, guidance, supervision, as well as the regulations over a number of different territories, including internet, as well as media. So perhaps we will find it a bit uncommon that we see that the government have the role to supervise or provide guidance to the media. Because usually we understand media from a more liberalism point of view, that we are basically check and balance forces. We the fourth essay, or perhaps we are watchdog journalism, but not basically the government in the role. But indeed, now it is a legal framework that the government has this kind of role to regulate the media. That is the first thing. Perhaps I argue that may be one kind of paradigm shift. That may we see the change from the older model to a newer model. That basically put it into Article 9. Article 10, that's concerned about national education system. And I think it's also one thing that we also already see some signal from the communities about the Article 43, which is about the law can have the power, the authority has the power to require individuals or a service provider to delete content from the platform, and also provide assistance to the authority. So we see, you follow news in a couple of days, you will also see that is some kind of story that some of the websites basically host outside Hong Kong were blocked, and that is not accessible. In Hong Kong, we need to use the VPN to access it. Perhaps sometime we could not use VPN also, we don't know. And also, we see some report that some of the information on the website, on some of the social media platforms, were requested by the authority to delete it. So that is something that, and also because the law basically don't require the court order. In the past, the old paradigm usually that is the norm, that the police can go through the court and request order and then can be conducted. But the certain since now the law now basically provide a legal vehicle for the people to just take it down. So based on what the law is written, as well as some of the cases that we observed in the past few months, that basically we see bit by bit now we are moving towards more this kinds of regulation in Hong Kong that usually we observe in mainland China. Not yet we have the Great Firewall, but at least we see some of this kinds of censorship issue happen in Hong Kong.
Thanks, Can I turn to Edmund to help us understand this this pressure for change? Right? The internet freedom, press freedom, the kind of liberal exceptionalism that Francis is talking about, used to be in the good old days, used to be considered part of Hong Kong's branding. Hong Kong's very proud of it, and it seemed to me as an outsider that even the establishment was very proud of that exceptionalism. So why is the establishment so much less enamored of this exceptionalism, internet freedom, press freedom? Any clues from your research?
Okay, thanks. Sure. I think, well, I somehow agree with Francis and Kim in the sense that that's a paradigm shift. So why suddenly even, I mean, when in the past when the pro-establishment and the government talk about Hong Kong is actually Hong Kong's uniqueness, like from other Chinese cities, for example. But now, I think they somehow downplay that. Of course, the wider picture will be, of course, the changing world order, right? U.S.-China rivalry, and in which Hong Kong's to make an exception to Hong Kong is somehow changed, right? Because Hong Kong is a window of China, but that is something that is not going to be the case. And in fact, sometimes, I mean, in terms of Hong Kong's opposition's movement, in Hong Kong's media freedom, there's always a belief that at least the Beijing government will consider the outside world's opinion. And that, I don't think it's completely gone, but at least it's not, the toleration has very much been decreasing after the 2019 protests and also the other social unrest and also other issues. But I would say I somehow want to pinpoint, actually try to also not to forecast, because as political scientists and social scientists, our forecasts tend to be wrong most of the time. But what I want to do is actually try to trace, I mean, why this kind of pressure has somehow changed. I would say at least, if you look at what happened after 1997 to Hanover, at least I would say there are three phrases in which there are more pressure on the media landscape. Okay, somehow correspond to some protest event. Okay, I mean, first with 2003, in which you see more after that, the Chinese central government actually talk more about controlling the mass media, because they believe that the media is not only doing what like Marco just raised, maybe it's not entirely on advocacy, but sometimes about mobilization. So they want to own the discourse, right? Because they believe that it's always on the defensive side. So they want to take over back from the discourse and by owning the media, mass media control. And we see a lot of mass media being owned by friendly pro-establishment figures. But I would say even after that, you see still a lot of professional autonomy, editorial autonomy being retained. And I think one of the reasons is apart from the journalists' own training, their evidence report, but also because of the market logic, right? Like why? Because market logic is about Hong Kong is an international city, you need freedom of information flow, and the market is also people's preference. And in this kind of liberal autocracy, what we tend to call Hong Kong in the past, you still need to care about people's preferences, their beliefs, citizens' preference. So we still see more preservation on that. But the second phrase will be more about online media. The emergence of online media, which are actually able to have fewer regulation in terms of the professional ethics. That they can do more sensational story. They can cover issues that cannot, there's still more regulation in terms of editorial precedence and professionalism in the mass media. And that also corresponds actually to the Occupy Central. Okay, actually before that, because when actually, if you recall, actually Occupy Central, when he proposed his idea, was published in the mass media outlet in Hong Kong. Okay, and then they see, okay, we need to win over the battle, we need to mobilize their own supporters through online media. But the first phrase I would say now, actually see from around 2019, you see the growth of KOL, pro-regime KOL. I'm not sure how many of you have looked at their channel. They're actually quite popular. Okay, and they actually...
Can you spell out KOL, or say what KOL means?
Oh, sorry. Key opinion leader. Okay, yeah, key opinion leader. Some of them are former pro-establishment figures, some are journalists, Okay, and they find a new way. I think that echo to some of the panelists said about this changing media landscape, not only in Hong Kong, but also in the wider part of the world. And I think those are also challenged, not directly from the government, but actually the new incentive system create a new challenge in terms of whether there's still room for more professional and also critical media. Because some of the facts offered in this kind of platform, both from the pro-regime side but also from the pro-democracy side, tends to be, how to say, I mean, it's very difficult to verify. And because of the way that media is being consumed and information is being consumed. So, quickly to the second question, I would say why the pro-regime does not really feel about this kind of pressure. I would say, well, there's still a lot of room of media freedom if you're supporting the government, a simple answer. But the other is that, I think it's also about, if you really talk about socio-economic issues they tend to talk about, it somehow fit into the official discourse. So why Hong Kong is not being well governed, they would argue, is because sometimes Hong Kong media professionals are just too critical. They just focus on the political issue, but not only focus on the socio-economic role. And those just drag Hong Kong behind. I think that is also part of it. And somehow you will see actually probably more report on that. Yeah, and so they don't really feel the pressure.
Thank you, Emin, for your opinion. Yeah, I think just from the panel manner, we know that there are different forces from the old paradigm, maybe like for the market logic, from the political pressures, from even the new technology seems open opportunity for the journalists to still remain somehow the autonomy. But however, we all know that the recent event happened at Apple Daily, and so after the latest arrest, and we all know that like now Apple Daily was locked down, and the management team, some of them has been arrested. And now the authorities still busy suing the rest of the media. They need not worry, although I think although people are still not be sure because we seems that the situation is getting worse. So I don't know anyone can answer these questions. Are people overreacting, or does the government why they keep still reassuring us? Like we still have the press freedom, we still can have freedom to report. Anyone?
Because I have been a journalist for 20 years here, more than 20 years here in Hong Kong, and I enjoy the press freedom for a long time, especially compared with mainland China, my peers in mainland China. Because they always envy journalists here in Hong Kong, and so I think the interesting thing is that the government still trying to assure the public that there is still press freedom here. So this makes journalists here in Hong Kong more difficult to work, because if you compare with mainland China, all the journalists understand the role of media and also understand their position being a journalist. For example, they're serving the interest of the party. So they totally understand what can do, what cannot do, and that there's a very clear boundary. Although the red line, so it's specific topics will change day by day, but the thing is there's a very specific, clear line for journalists, and which are able to keep them away from risks, a dangerous situation. But here in Hong Kong, because of the government still assure the public and also the journalists that we still have enjoyed the press of freedom, which means you can do your job as normal. And the government officials also give definitions. There's no definition, but give the term that's normal news. So this reminds me as in mainland China, the journalists always were warned by the management and the officials that you should not do the negative news. So that was a very Chinese characteristic term, negative news, because we only have news. There's no negative news or positive news. But here in Hong Kong, now we have a normal news. that moment. so that would make journalists more confused about what they can do and how, so maybe they consider it's normal, but the government or the authority or maybe some entities consider that will violate the NSL, so have the some harmful to the national security. So yeah, I personally would think, okay, if the government is trying to monitor media, they should do more. They should provide more details about their understanding about what are the press freedom situation now, how to interpret press freedom, and what are the in details are related to national security.
Maybe to add to what Rosa said, and also to respond to Jenny's question of are people overreacting. I guess in a society when you have a law like that, national security law, and then as a lot of legal experts have already said, it's really broadly phrased and vaguely phrased. That certainly is it's actually a very simple point here is what Michael has already said at the beginning, that is basically to induce self-censorship. And in a society, it's actually very difficult to have no one overreacting. There are certainly people who are courageous enough to stand firm. There are people who have a more measured reaction to what's happening, but there are also necessarily, inevitably, some people who are overreacting. And then you have, in a society, you have a lot of dynamics going on. You think about how I remember I was talking to some of my colleagues and talking about the kind of social mechanisms of self-censorship. How people come to start to self-censor. You think about if we again you think about the public libraries in Hong Kong, right? They have taken down 30-something books, okay? And you look at the list of the books they have taken down. Some of them you really question, why do you want to take down that book, right? It's pretty far off. But you think about okay, the fact is the public libraries have taken down those books. Okay, so what if you are running a library in a secondary school, right? That cannot have no effect on you, frankly speaking, right? And then these kind of effects or implications just diffuse over across the society that generate that pervasive practices, a pervasive sense of self-censorship. I think, as we know, in many, if we study the operation of many authoritarian countries, we know that this is actually one typical mechanism for authoritarian states to induce self-censorship, right? To set up some kind of legal mechanisms, but actually phrased them very vaguely, okay? And then let the various social mechanisms operate so that people will start to self-censor. And then over time, then, as I said, they might reach a new equilibrium, so to speak, where you don't have absolutely no freedom. It wouldn't be the case, but obviously the space of operation would have been contracted very substantially.
I think I want to return to this topic of self-censorship in greater detail in the coming minutes, because I think it's quite central. My own view is that self-censorship may be the death of Hong Kong in a way that direct coercion through the NSL won't be. So I do hope we can talk about that more. Well, I'll return to try to get to the nub of Janet's question earlier, which maybe I could rephrase it like this. If we think of what's happened to, do we think of what happened to Apple Daily as the new rule or merely an exception? And if Hong Kong is the exception to the rest of China, is Apple Daily therefore an exception to the exception, or is it? I know it gets a bit convoluted, but the general signal, the reassurance that the authorities seem to be giving us is that the rest of the media shouldn't matter. This is entirely directed at a rogue publication in their eyes called Apple Daily. The rest of you are not a rogue publication, so why are you worried? And they don't seem to understand. They don't seem to understand why anyone would get worried. Can't everyone see that this is just directed at Apple Daily? What's your response to that? Is everyone being this unnecessarily panicky? Can't they see that this is just what Apple Daily? Why should anyone worry? Francis. Okay,
First of all, I will. Basically, I don't have the answer. Sorry. Yeah. Basically, I don't have the answer. But I think that there's a couple of reasons I don't know the answer. First, because that has been quite a while that Apple Daily was considered of one of the major targets by the China state. So you can see a lot of, in multiple different occasions, in the state media coverage by the government, Chinese authority, they are basically openly criticize Apple Daily, name calling Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai for many times. So basically, the major target for the so that's why a lot of speculation basically. First, after the introduction of the NSL last year, basically, basically Apple Daily was the first target. But basically now it's already a year after. So, that's why some of the people might say that not really surprising because it finally found a way to crack down the whole Apple Daily. So in this sense, this is basically is the exception. Sounds like it's targeted, but at the same time, that back to some of the mention about now, this is a new media logic, a new normal, or perhaps what we call paradigm shift. I think from time, just a matter of time, that will introduce a lot of concept that in the Chinese media system into the Hong Kong media system. Just like I just mentioned about Article 9, they'll introduce the government role in guidance. That basically the terms used in China called public opinion guidance. That will introduce in Hong Kong. Another role they call is have a supervision. That council, it seems to suggest something like Xi Jinping in 2013, that name and ask the media, state media, you should be loyal to the party. So I think in some sense they will introduce this kind of idea that perhaps at some point media you should be patriots. That's kind of idea will be introduced in Hong Kong. I'm not saying you can't be watchdog, you still can be the fourth estate, but you still need to patriot, some form of this kind of introduction, this kind of idea in Hong Kong. So in this sense, in the long run, basically other media would, if you don't follow this logic, that you may have the same end games, like Apple Daily. That basically is a signal. So let's see what happened to the other couple of very independent media.
It could induce self-censorship as well. Right? Marco, I wonder if I could, because this is certainly not just a Hong Kong thing, right? There's a bit of, I always forget who gets killed, the monkey or the chicken. But I know one of them gets chicken to scare the others. Is it, help me out here. Who gets killed, who gets scared?
The chicken gets
The chicken gets killed to scare the monkeys or whatever, right? So there's a bit of that, there's a bit of divide and rule. These are sort of common techniques of illiberal authoritarian regimes, right? I mean, Marco, can you tell us a little more?
So, yeah, sure, of course. I think we should always remember that it's been, we should always remember that it's been more than 100 years since the first Communist Revolution, and communists were the first to use media, to take media very seriously. I mean, there's no question about that. At the level that's unprecedented, at that time especially. So, I think they should be treated very seriously. I think at one end, I can see many different models evolving. Okay? In my own home country, media is officially free, and you have many different kinds of media organizations, but they have shifted into directions that's very predictable, and partly through ownership. So basically through proxy ownership. No one knows who owns the media anymore because it's a very complex business kind of conglomerates. Oftentimes telecom. So I think I would probably say telecom is the next target. Cable companies, these kind of providers, because they regulate what gets delivered to your home. Right? So it doesn't mean necessarily that you will be censored, but the channels, the TV channels that will get to your room will definitely can be determined by whoever owns the infrastructure. Right? Another thing is the size of the market. it's a very small market. That's kind of unattractive. And I'm seriously concerned about, well, okay, we close one newspaper, so is there another one opening? And if so, how is this newspaper financed? I frankly, I spend a lot of time in the classroom, obviously, or on Zoom. I don't see a model for hard news in these days, to be honest. It doesn't seem to be working so much. Different models may be, and I guess given the legal framework in Hong Kong and some traditions, perhaps we should look into Australian case, where they finally said, well, social media companies will have to pay. And it was a tough battle, but they won. And from now on they're going to have a few cents per, I don't know, a few millions of dollars that Facebook makes in Australia. But there has to be some kind of business model. I think the idea that ideology will pay for it is to some extent mistaken, at least if you don't have very rich parents. I've seen in some other cases where the logic of ideology has been transformed into business ideology through essentially complete publicization of anything serious. So, for instance, I read a lot of news from my home country too, and frankly, there's almost no serious journalism anymore. Within about 20 years, we're completely free, but within 20 years, it's been completely wiped out. So I think that if you ask me what the real threat is, I think that's a real threat. Because again, very small markets, not terribly attractive with a lot of regulation, easy to get in trouble. I would be concerned about that. I see, for instance, I would see at the same time an opportunity, which would be to have a kind of a Hong Kong version of RT, of Russia Today. That could work. I see that. Yeah. So I mean, something like that could work, and my bet would be that something like that, or many channels like that, will emerge.
Thanks. We're fortunate to have in the audience, I think he's arrived, Ronson Chan, are you here? Yeah. Great, wonderful. Ronson is the new head of the Hong Kong Journalists Association. We've been hearing a lot from academics, but we're privileged to have a leader of the profession here. I wonder if you could share your perspectives briefly and set trend lines.
Hello, I'm sorry for my lateness because I work in the Star News. I don't know if it is a chicken or the monkey. Well, everyone, almost half of Hong Kong know that after the Apple Daily, that we will have a very high risk of searching or other things. I think. So I'll have to apologize for my lateness again. I have been newly elected in the last Saturday, and after my new term as a chairman, in the afternoon of the Saturday, that I understood that the Apple Daily cannot be no longer the last. I learned this news. It depends on only when it will end. Well, I've prepared some pieces of words, but just mostly about the Apple Daily situation. What I have to mention more is I spoke to my journalist colleagues and media friends through the WhatsApp group of JA after my new term start. I told them that the freedom of press is fragile today. It's meaningless to claim its darkest hour. We still believe that Hong Kong needs news, journalists, facts and truth, and the responsibility falls on our shoulders. That means the frontline journalists. To stand firm to our colleagues and earn press freedom, however little that may be. What we are very concerned is, according to the accusation from the police, that in the Apple Daily incident, the arrest persons, some of them are the directors of the next media group, alleged to connect request foreign countries, institutions, organizations, and individuals to impose sanction on HKSAR and PRC. And the evidence coming by the police, including around 30 articles, police saying that the articles called for the sanction on China. But the journalists are so confused and worried about that those 30 articles. Are they included in new reports, a commentary, or the readers' articles, etc.? What's the type of this article? The police have not said very clearly. Moreover, as the practice of our journalist industry, everyone, as we know, that the editorial is independent away from the corporate management. That means the directors cannot interfere what the decision by the editorial. We understand that. I can say both in the standards is practiced just like that. So I can't see a very strong correlations between the editorial decision and the viewings of the management. How is it? It had a very strong correlations. I can't see it. But you can see that under the police accusation and the assumption that they think that the directors can give the directions to the editorial and then write many articles or reports. So for me, I think that this is also the JA standing, that we are very worried about the journalists and the writers, that we are easy to trap under the law. So, and moreover, when we looking on the articles on the national security law, that some terms like insights, best are so very vague terms, and you can imagine that the news materials can be easy to accuse for using for such purpose. So of course, besides the criminal offense of the national security law, that we will find that the journalists were not easy to access public information within the last year. No matter the car plate number, information of directors in the company registry, and the important information of the defendant in the charge sheet in the court, many important information will be hidden by the authority, or cannot be searched for the press purpose. So the situation is worse and worse. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, and I think one key takeaway, of course, is that this is a battle that's happening on multiple fronts. Right? It's not just on the NSL legal front. Some of them are some administrative tweaks that make it harder for journalists to access information, to carry out investigative journalism that they did before, and so on. And this actually leads me to another question that I had concerning RTHK, which we have not mentioned so far. Right? The actions taken against RTHK are less sensational than what's happened at Apple. And I think this is actually reflected in international media coverage. I did a quick check and found that in the 6 months from November 2020, the New York Times carried 4 articles mentioning RTHK compared to 15 mentioning Jimmy Lai. The BBC website shows stories about Jimmy Lai on 8 days and about RTHK on 1 day. So there's no doubt, I mean, it's not surprising that RTHK is a lot less newsy because the interventions have not been as overt, direct, and sensational. But I want to suggest that it's pretty significant to what is happening there. And I wonder if Francis, would you share that view that we shouldn't forget about RTHK?
Well, of course. I of course I agree with Cherry on the point that when it comes to international media, obviously everyday Jimmy Lai are symbolic, very symbolic, and the action taken against everyday is more dramatic, so to speak, and so more sensational, and so they catch more attention. But from a more local perspective, I think things happening to RTHK are sensational enough, frankly speaking, right? I guess the things that or the various issues, events that have been happening to RTHK in the past few years actually goes back to my point that the kind of paradigm shift that we are talking about. I think RTHK in the past 6 to 9 months is a very prime example of how professionalism is being undermined. Okay, so that there is all these moves that actually defy professional logic. I mean, the most obvious move, of course, that defies professional logic is withdrawing from participation in journalism awards. right? I mean, no matter what they do, in other cases, I mean, the act of refusing to participate in journalism award competition is basically a move to cut itself off from the professional community, right? Because no matter who holds those journalism awards are organized by members of the professional community to recognize what is being regarded as the best work. So award competition has always been, in the US, we talk about Pulitzer Prize. In Taiwan, there are their own journalism awards. Even in mainland China, they have journalism awards, right? Because in any country, any society, you have the profession, and the profession would use awards competitions as a means to uphold professional standards. And so refusing to participate in that is actually to basically to say that I don't want to be judged by my professional community. Okay, I don't care about the views of the professional community. So I think that is actually symbolic, and of course, with all and another thing about symbolic about RTHK, that is regard to professionalism, is how the new leadership at RTHK basically refused to explain their actions in an adequate manner. In fact, when you compare RTHK with even, for example, even TVB. Now, TVB, of course, is regarded by many Hong Kong people, especially the pro-democracy people, pro-democracy citizens, as very conservative. But actually, even if we go back to, for example, TVB during the umbrella movement, the so-called 7 Police controversy, they kind of, censored or kind of changed the voiceover after capturing the police officers beating people, beating a protester on the street. Even back then, I mean, the news director, would have to actually try to talk to the news staff, and they had to he had to try to explain his actions in the terminology of professionalism. He was arguing that the original voiceover was not objective enough. Now, of course, people might not be convinced by what he said, but at least he had to talk in those terms, right? Whereas these days, the RTHK leadership, now, of course, they still say, it's not fair, it's not impartial. Yeah, but it's increasingly empty, right? There's no substance to it, and there's no no opportunities for the staffers to actually have a more in-depth discussions with the leadership regarding, so then how do you define impartiality? What do you see as impartial, not impartial? So basically, again, as I said, it's a kind of a rejection of this kind of professional discourse, this kind of professional communication. And that is, for me, RTHK, for me, it's the prime example if we talk about, how professionalism is being undermined within the Hong Kong media after, or in the past 12 months.
Yeah, Rose, please.
I just want to echo Francis's comments on RTHK. So for me, I think RTHK is an example of a paradigm shift. It's a more like from a PSB, public service broadcasting, to a propaganda tool. So this is, you can see, that's why the management and the professional staff, there's a hierarchy now. Because before, it's if you were a public service professionalism did a lot of work, but now it's more like an administrative level and instructions. But this is more like the state media. Like you can compare RTHK to CCTV now. Your job is to propagate government ideas and public policies. So that's a foundationally change, and also it's one example. And also talk about Apple Daily. I would not say it's the exceptionals. It's the last target. So think about that. If we talk about ownership or how to change the control of the mainstream media here in Hong Kong, they already be controlled. I think Apple Daily is the last one was not able to be interferenced by the state. In other mainstream media, you can change the ownership directly or indirectly. You can change the top management, the newsroom structure. But for Apple Daily, seems like very difficult to using that kind of strategies. So hard repression finally to be used. And then that was the first wave for the mainstream media. And maybe next time, the coming or the alternative media, it's just because after umbrella movement, there's a lot of investment on online media by state funding. So I think they're still using very defensive strategy, for example, like using KOL, because here is the open society, you need to compete with different narratives. But if they failed, who knows? So maybe the harder pressure will be used.
Thank you. Yes,
Follow a bit about Rose's comment because I mean, in mainland China, there's still a lot of people watching CCTV, right? But my question is actually, I mean, we see after the restructuring of the RTHK, I mean, the view counts just dramatically drops. I go back to my question about market logic, right? I mean, if you preserve and spend so many money despite so many effort in restructuring, but you end up with owning or reproducing a institution that cannot really reach the people. And what's that for? I don't know. I mean, in the short term, we know the leadership, they have their own logic, their own incentive, so on. But I'm not sure whether, how you see, I mean, maybe in the medium term, or go back to Sharon question about certain kind of, whether they will reach certain kind of equilibrium or some new logic will emerge.
I really want to add one thing is for state-owned media, they don't care about the revenues and income. They only care about the influences or how many people they can reach. CCTV, there's a lot of audiences because of the dominated, right? But here in Hong Kong, it's still our open society. You have the competitions. So if you don't like RTHK, you can have other small choices. But look at the mainland China, look at the Southern Weekly, Nanhuang Zhonghuo. They're dying. It's just because they changed the structure and all the editorial content, so the audience abandoned them. And also Phoenix here in Hong Kong. I work for Phoenix for more than 20 years, and witnessed the declining, the losing of audiences just because of the control. But nowadays you can see it became state-owned. Before, the Chinese government was shy to have a direct state-owned media company here in Hong Kong. They're using maybe representatives or other ways. But now they just inject money, and the company now is directly controlled under the state council. So yeah, that's why I say RT will be soon here in Hong Kong because I heard that they are going to inject a huge amount of money to boost the Phoenix.
Right, but what I also hear you say is that we have to understand the competitive environment, right? So it would be a mistake for planners to believe that RTHK, if treated like CCTV, could actually have the influence and reach of CCTV, because CCTV operates in a very monopolistic setting. Unless, of course, the game plan is to completely do away with one country, two systems, such that Hong Kong is not only behind the Great Firewall, it also removes all alternative news sources and so on, and gives RTHK a monopoly over TV news, which CCTV effectively has, at least at certain time slots and so on. So it's a big ask, and it seems to be overreaching if there is any sort of ambition to make RTHK as controlled and as influential as CCTV. So I find it difficult to see how that can happen. I mean, to me, the thing that makes RTHK very interesting as a case is that it seems like a quintessentially Hong Kong institution, in the sense that on paper, it is not a public service broadcaster. It is set up as a government department, full stop, and half its employees are technically civil servants, I guess. Right? And yet it has chosen to believe that it is a public service broadcaster. The public treat it as a public service broadcaster. And even officialdom is kind of, has out of convention, been obliged to treat it as a public service broadcaster, which is kind of bizarre because the convention doesn't actually match what it technically is, which is a government department. And in a way, to me, that is very Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is not a democracy, but it has chosen to act like it is, and that what is essentially a fiction has become reality. I mean, Hong Kong's spirit is democratic, even though technically it isn't. And to me, RTHK is a kind of a microcosm of that. But you know, where are we heading? We keep asking that question, and we talked a little bit about whether we have reached an equilibrium. I want to ask Edmund, do you expect what's happened last year to be extrapolated in kind of a straight line way, right? A steep and continuous decline in media freedom, or will trends plateau into some kind of new equilibrium? I mean, I know you said that you're not into making predictions, but give us a prediction anyway.
I think because some of us are, my panelists can chip in, but I think a lot of us studying not only Hong Kong, but also some illiberal society. We tend to see, I mean, after a very new regulative environments, things somehow will stabilize. I mean, in other example that we see. Because, for example, I mean, I'm a political scientist, we understand, I mean, no matter what kind of regime you are at, you want to govern. Well, you want to govern in the way you need. I mean, there are eruption at the very beginning, but then to stabilize because you still need to really get feedback from the society. And the media is always one of the media that is very important. Okay, maybe there will be more red lines, that people will adjust, that kind of things will happen. And people will, that's what tends to happen in a lot of Southeast Asia countries or society that we're familiar with. And of course, the Hong Kong case can be, whether we follow that path or we will be another exceptions, it's difficult. I mean, I remember one of my colleagues who studied Chinese politics for years. He made this, I will not reveal his name, but he made this forecast. I think that is worth sharing. He said that Hong Kong may be an exception in the sense precisely because Hong Kong has a strong civil society. In the sense that the resistance will still be strong. But when you resist more, then the perceived threat by the regime also increase. Right? In the sense that then you need to make another exceptions, and that will also threaten the societies and the way that media is and is being conducted, and the way that we express our freedom of speech and so on. So I really don't have an answer, a clear answer, but I would say, at least I can add one point, maybe a little bit positive, following Chairman's recent remark. I think at least it still needs some time for the authority to really monopolize Hong Kong's media landscape. And Hong Kong is always unique, at least in the sense that even the so-called pro-establishment camp, we tend to see it as a united force. But it's actually more divided and decentralized than we believe to be. They have their own interests, they have their own preaching crime systems and so on. So even that will create a little bit more uncertainty in the path. And it's also, I mean, even when you have full control of the RTHK, I mean, people will still find ways to find ways to a little bit critical of the government, especially when it comes to other investigative reports or so-called social inequality and that kind of things. I think in some sense that can be also quite powerful, in the sense that, I mean, you know, at this point, when we really talk about some political issue, I mean, the officials, they have a clear stand. But sometimes when you report on other issues, it can still, like what will happen in the past in this kind of hybrid sector, they can still push the government, corner the government to one point that they need to respond, because they, I mean, for those issues, I mean, fit into an official discourse, they have no choice but really to see whether or not they need to adjust their policy. So these could be some trend that we may expect to see.
I guess, on the question of whether it would, form an equilibrium, and also back to the question of, Aphrodite's case, whether it would be the quote-unquote exceptional case. I guess, one very basic thing that we should mention is that the NSL, the law is there, but the first case has not even arrived, right? I mean, there's not been up to now. I mean, the first NSL case will actually start 2 days later, right? The tumultuous case. So basically, we still have don't know at this moment how the cases would actually be adjudicated in court. Apple Daily, I mean, right now the court has not yet publicized it on how the police identify which articles are problematic, but they will be publicized after all, right? When the case actually goes to court, I mean, the police will have to actually put forward which articles are actually problematic for what reasons. So basically, whenever you have a case like the Apple Daily case right now, I mean, the outcome would necessarily involve the actual drawing of a red line, right? And of course, I personally don't think that, the Hong Kong government would draw all the red lines very clearly by just one case. Okay, obviously, I mean, you have one case, and it might be, through that case, certain red lines might be drawn more clearly, but there are also still the possible thing is that there are still other, ambiguous areas still there, right? So I guess, basically what I personally would expect is that, you will see these cases, the trials of these cases going on. There might be other cases related to the media. Of course, I hope not, but there's always a possibility. But obviously, through the actual cases, through the actual trials, okay, the ambiguities, okay, would not totally disappear, but will subside a little bit. Okay, so that is the kind of a movement toward a somewhat clearer picture. Okay, as time goes by, I think that would be kind of a natural development. Yeah.
Thanks, Evan and Francis, for the view about the equilibrium. I think the good news is we have a strong civic society, but maybe the bad news is still time for us to see when we can reach the equilibrium, especially when we talk about the case. It seems that it takes a long queue to see what happened for the case on the court. So can we return to a point that Rose and Marco raised earlier about reporting on China? We all know that Hong Kong is the main gateway to China. So it made Hong Kong as a major media hub and a very special city. And what do you think? Do you think still Hong Kong can play this kind of role to have where is the line for China reporting? Yeah.
I'm going to kind of continue with Francis is also one reason here. So I think if we wait for the case law to kind of go to boundaries, we'll wait for many years. And many people will be hurt in the process. So, realistically speaking, we're looking at years. So, that I guess that process is fine. It will be to some extent definitive, but it will take many, many years, and in many years' time, who knows what's going to happen. My preference would be to really aggressively pursue some kind of self-regulation, like industry regulation, and draw the boundaries in advance and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I just want to give a couple of examples of, there are some liberal democracies with extraordinary freedom of press, like Germany, but still, if you advocate Nazism, you go to jail. In Thailand, if you offend the king, you go to jail. In Singapore, if you offend the other race, you go to jail. But other things are okay. So I'll give you an example about reporting on China. Very interesting case, right? So Fudan University, for those of you who don't know, is building a campus in Budapest, in Hungary. I would have expected to build a campus here, but I guess I was wrong about that. Of course, it's very controversial because another campus one of the universities just exited Budapest about 2 years ago. It was a very different kind of university. And of course, this is not an investment, this is more like a loan. So It's within Hungary, it's a fairly controversial decision. It's very vigorously pursued by President Orban, Prime Minister Orban, sorry. But for instance, is reporting about this case, would that be to some extent threat to national security? I mean, my guess is no, but we don't know, right, at this point. And then all the activities, for instance, related to Belt and Road. Is any of this undermining national security? I don't know. My guess is probably not. But if we go by case law, it would take many years and many nights in jail with someone else's socks wearing and something like that. So I would probably say find a very large database of imperfect freedoms in the world and try to see which ones you care about most and which ones could be negotiated, and try to create a framework that's workable and present it sooner rather than later. It's a long summer. We don't have anywhere to travel. That's my message to the working professionals. I'm not a working professional, at least not in a journalism field. I'm in media education. My concerns are very different. I can tell what my concerns are. My concerns are freedom of speech in the classroom. All my lectures are recorded now. Everyone knows that, and as a consequence, there's not much debate going on other than very small chit chat. This is an issue for me. Another issue is that we're a journalism school. I mean, media communication department. So, what do I offer these folks? Internships, where? Jobs. If they're going to be KOLs and TikTok stars, they should just drop out. They should not waste money with us. I have nothing to add to this. I mean, seriously, I really have nothing to add to this. And finally, I mean, and this is something that affects us directly, is faculty recruitment, right? So the educators, where are they going to come from? Imagine on that, like, there's a great journalism and media education job in Hong Kong. Please come. It's going to be difficult, and I think, for our own sake, we need to address these things sooner rather than later. If we wait for the government to regulate for us, I mean, they will eventually, but you don't know what the outcome is, and it could take years. In years' time, there might be other cities and countries that are more important.
Yes, thanks, Michael, for the response, and I believe we all keep adapt to these changes, and even we are very fortunate to have today in our audience. We have Keith here, Richberg, who is not only the director of the Journalism and Media Center at HKU, but also the current president of the Foreign Correspondence Club FCC, like HKJA. We all know that you guys are also facing the changes now in Hong Kong. Can you share your perspective as a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm also with HKU Journalism, so I'm an educator, and I'm also wearing the hat as the president of the FCC, so maybe I have two targets directed at me. From just wearing the hat of an educator, I would just echo what Marco said, which is, we're still grappling with, how to proceed. My message to the students and my colleagues like King Hua is just full steam ahead, because we don't know where the red lines are, so we don't intend to paint the red lines for them. We're just going to go ahead and let them, tell us, At the moment, I think we're fine, because if you look at the four categories of crimes under national security, well, terrorism, we don't have any terrorists in our program, and secession, we don't advocate anything, we just teach people how to do journalism. Subversion with state power, we're not trying to subvert anything, unless you can consider doing critical journalism as trying to subvert state power. Collusion with foreign forces, well, I am foreign, so I don't know what that means. The only thing I've seen on that is we can't invite consuls general to come and talk to our students as before, because I think they have to get permission from the foreign ministry to go there, etc. The only two areas where we've had to make, or we might have to make, or we had to make maybe some small change would be, we teach media law, and so our media law instructor has had to add in a couple of sessions on national security law, because we teach journalists anywhere in the world, you have to obey the law. And like Marco was saying, in Germany, you can't talk about Nazism. In Thailand, you can't, criticize the king. In Malaysia or Indonesia, you can't blasphemize the prophet. So every country has its red lines. The difference, as you mentioned in China, is we don't know where the red lines are. But we don't intend to paint the red lines for them and let them know. In terms of foreign correspondence, because this is my second time as president of the FCC. I was here in '97. I can tell you, it's interesting. Hong Kong used to be the place that foreign correspondents came when they got kicked out of China. Because, you got kicked out of China, you came in Hong Kong. This was always open. I lived here from 97 to 2000. I never even had a journalist visa or journalist card because there was no such thing. You just came in, you did your work, nobody cared, you go to press conferences. So one of the things, a couple of things we're worried about. Number one, we are worried about if they follow the pattern of what happens with foreign journalists in mainland China, they might start using or utilizing the visa system as a way to try to control what journalists can come in and come out. That would not affect people who've been here for many years and have permanent residency, but a lot of people come here on 2-year, 4-year rotations and then need to go every couple of years to get their visa renewed. So I imagine many of them might want to become a little bit more cautious, especially when it comes time for their visa to be renewed. The second area I think foreign correspondents are worried about, they're worried about all press freedom in general, but I mean specifically to the foreign correspondents. When I was based in Beijing, I was there during the entire Bo Xilai incident, etc., and when Chen Guangchang escaped from his house arrest and made it. We got a lot of our reports out of Hong Kong. I would have to stay up every night to wait for the Hong Kong 11 o'clock news to know what was going on in China, because that's how we got our tips as to what was happening, because sometimes various factions in China would release things to Hong Kong media and we would find out afterwards. So if that's going to dry up now, that's going to be very interesting. And then the other thing that foreign correspondents are very concerned about is in these national security cases ongoing, particularly with the arrest of those who participated in the primaries. In the bail hearings, for some, they have used interviews that these people gave with foreign reporters to say this proves this person is colluding with foreign forces, or this proves this person is influential with the foreign media. And so some of my working journalist colleagues, because I'm an educator now, but some of them say, look, they've had people calling up saying, please erase my contacts out of your phone. Please don't. One of them said, a longtime source says, look, I like you, but please don't ever call me again. So this sort of thing is going to really put a damper on how foreign correspondents can operate if nobody wants to talk to them, because talking to a foreign correspondent could be used against you sometime in the future. And then last thing we're worried about is this Apple Daily case. Obviously it's a sad thing for me when any newspaper closes anywhere in the world. We've had a lot close in the U.S. for economic reasons. But when they mention the fact that there are some, I don't know, I've read 30 articles and many of these were op-ed pieces, opinion pieces, advocating some things. I teach feature writing and I use a couple of weeks of that course to talk about opinion writing, first person feature, opinions. Opinion writing is a part of journalism. And so if you're saying that there are certain things that you can't write your opinion about, that would put a pretty big chilling effect on things. People right now are talking about the Olympics in Beijing. Should there be a diplomatic boycott of that? Now, is that off limits? Can you not mention that anymore because you might be accused of a national security violation? Is that advocating sanctions if you say people shouldn't go to the Beijing Olympics? We don't know, because we don't know where that red line is, so we're waiting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And I think let's segue to this topic of our role as academics and teachers. In fact, there have been a number of questions from the audience asking us this. Grace Leung from CHK asked, how is NSL, will it affect media program courses at universities? Jeff Regraggio, who is one of our PhD candidates, asks, how does the contemporary state of media freedom in Hong Kong impact the way media and law courses are taught in the city, and so on. So there is, I think, interest in our audience to explore this topic more. I just want to preface this by saying that the 4 universities that are represented here on this panel are all in the top 100 universities for media and communication in QS rankings. And make this further point that no city in the world other than London has more universities in the top 100 for our field. But there is a strong push to put academic freedom into global rankings. In the Academic Freedom Index, this year marks the first time that Hong Kong dipped below Singapore. So I do hope that our University Grants Committee and the government are sensitive to whatever this new paradigm is going to be, sensitive to what it could do to the global competitiveness of our universities, which I hope they agree. One of Hong Kong's great assets. Yeah. So after that little speech, let me ask. let me ask Francis. I mean, you direct the school at CUHK. have your teachers had to change the way they teach journalism?
No, I would like to say no, I hope. Because, just like what you said, I guess, at least at our school, what we are, or in the past 1 year, I have we have actually organized this kind of, internal seminar, or not actually seminar, just briefing, okay, not to the students, who work for the practical news magazines. And basically, I just told them two things. I mean, my overall messages are twofold. On the one hand, I urge them not to self-censor. Okay, so we are running a journalism and communication school. The last thing we want is for you guys to have self-censorship. So you just propose whatever topics you want to do. Okay, just feel free to do so. I also tell them, on the other hand, the law exists, and so we cannot pretend that it does not exist. Okay, so the law is there. Therefore, what it meant in practice is that you just feel free to propose whatever you want to do. Okay, but we cannot rule out the possibility that the teachers in charge of the news magazines or the practical magazines might need to discuss with the students, okay, on exactly how to approach certain topics. We try not to ban topics, but we did tell students that on certain topics there might be, okay, reasons to be more careful. So there might be things that we might want to do. We still want to, allow people to do whatever they want to do, but there could be times when if things are already too sensitive, there might be, need for some kind of adjustment. Okay. So I guess, what we have been trying to do at CHK is at least to provide, the space, okay, for people to continue to operate. And by the way, in one sense, just like what Keith said, we're not doing political theory. We are not doing political philosophy. That helps, okay? We don't need to debate, normatively whether this political system is better than that political system. We are just doing journalism, right? So basically, we are, in one sense, we're training people to just report on, mainly to report on what happens in the world. So presumably, again, even for the teachers, I guess our message to the teachers is that, we are just doing education, and we are doing journalism education, and we should just keep doing what we are doing, okay? With, of course, and I don't think, the teachers need my advice or anyone's advice for them to know what we are facing. And if individual teachers really feel like, okay, on this topic I might want to be a little bit more careful, or want to, for example, even last year I was invited by secondary school to actually talk to secondary school teachers. And even then, these days the secondary school teachers might worry about whether they can talk about June 4th and things like that. And again, from my perspective, I could not ask them to self-censor, right? But I also could not, irresponsibly tell them that, just go ahead and do whatever you want to do, right? Because there is actually the risk, right? The only advice I can give is that, of course, we hope we can continue to talk about, what professionally we believe that we should talk about. Okay, maybe whenever we talk about June 4th, then you need to prepare yourself better, right? Have better, drawing more upon, academic sources, proven academic sources, etc., to kind of protect yourself a bit. So I guess, we individually, our teachers and students will have to adjust. But at least, from the institutional perspective, up to this point, at least, we would still hope that we can maintain that, free space as much as possible. That has been our approach to face this issue.
Can I invite C.K. Lau, who's my department head at the journalism department of Baptist University. How do you approach this challenge?
Thank you, Sharon. Actually, after the national security law was introduced, I think I did something that similar to what Francis did. I actually hosted a meeting with all the practicum instructors. The practicum members who were responsible for supervising the students' publication of our experimental newspaper. Basically saying that, okay, the law is there, right? You may not like it, but the law is there. The last thing that you want to do is drag the student through a legal process. So we say, well, as I said, we don't want to censor ourselves, but if the students do want to touch on those sensitive topics, the instructors have a responsibility to go through, the stories, discuss them thoroughly with the students, so that we know what we're doing. I think that's the attitude that we should have as educators. And I think our program, like similar programs elsewhere, we all have press law as a course. Mediation of the national security law is introduced. We ask our instructors to invite legal experts on to talk about the law. But it's disappointing that many common law lawyers they don't exactly know what the law is about, because the law is imposed by Beijing. It's not written in the usual language that common law lawyers are familiar with. So we're now still awaiting the outcome of various cases to know exactly what the provisions mean. So that makes it difficult. But going on a broader issue, I think it's interesting. Keith has sort of mentioned a number of scenarios, right? Talking about colluding with foreign forces, right? Now, I'm going back to the Apple case, right? I'm just bringing it up for discussion, right? Jim and I went all the way to Washington, D.C., met the vice president at the time, right? Is that okay? Now, I think professionally and morally speaking, a lot of people say, oh, well, it might not be a very good idea. But legally, should someone who have done that be held responsible? I think that is debatable, right? A lot of people want Hong Kong to have democracy, but whether you should bring in a foreign government to put pressure in China to give Hong Kong democracy, I don't know. That's the controversial thing. And whether that should be penalized, that is the key issue, right? From a professional point of view, certainly, if we report the fact that someone is doing that, I think that should not be a problem, right? But for a newspaper proprietor to do that, is that okay? Legally, professionally, and morally? I think that is the key issue that we have to think about. And I'm talking about the equilibrium that we're doing, right? I think I would like to respond to what Ellen said. What Hong Kong has gone through is a very serious period of social unrest. I think I can only see the similar things happening with 1967. I was very young at the time. But I think at that time, several left-wing newspapers were shut down temporarily by the colonial authorities. But after the riot, what you saw was that the British government decided that, okay, well, things are really bad in Hong Kong, that there are sort of social and economic reasons. So they sent in Macklin Holes, implemented a lot of improvements in terms of government. And that sort of somehow appeased the population a little bit. And so over time, the press became less critical, even the left-wing press, and of course they also lost support, right? So what I'm interested to know is, if we were, if anybody running Hong Kong, what would they be doing now, next step, right? Targeting the press is first thing that they would have to do. Next thing, what are you going to do? If Hong Kong continues to suffer from the very serious wealth disparity, deteriorating social conditions, I think there's nothing to stop Hong Kong from having another riot. But and now that Letchko is now filled by patriots, true patriots from Beijing's point of view, hopefully things improve. But we don't know, right? Hopefully things improve and people don't feel the need to protest. And we end up like Singapore. That would be the best scenario. But I think none of us could have any hints as to what will happen. But hopefully the best scenario will prevail rather than the worst one. That's what I said.
Well, we had a couple of questions from the audience as well, targeting me, asking for Singapore, Hong Kong. I don't want to go there. I'll just say that a lot of the comparisons that are made between Singapore and Hong Kong are very ahistorical. Looking at Singapore's calm now versus the turmoil in Hong Kong. Forgetting that Singapore is calm now because of turbulence 50 years ago, right? So Singapore went through roughly what Hong Kong is going through now, 50 years ago. In fact, coincidentally, I think this last month was the 50th anniversary, and the scenario will sound very similar. The 50th anniversary of the roundup of 4 key executives of Singapore's most popular Chinese language newspaper, which was accused of having foreign links, accused of stoking up populist sentiment among the population, and so on. Some differences. The roundup in Singapore did not involve arrest warrants or a trial. The Internal Security Act was used, which allows arrest without warrant and detention without trial. So the executives of Nanyang Siangpao in Singapore, who were detained 50 years ago, went straight into detention for the next 2 years without trial. A few years later, the publisher of the Nanyang Siangpao was detained for 5 years, again without warrant and without trial. Yeah. So the calm that we see in Singapore is not, it needs to be seen in the context of a 50-year, very concerted, extremely systematic and determined effort to remove all competition in media, as well as in universities and unions and so on. That's my only caution for comparativists who want to look at Hong Kong and Singapore. Look at the long view, don't just look at Singapore today. We have technically run out of time, but I think the conversation is just getting started. No. With the panel's indulgence and the audience's permission as well, I propose to extend by another 10-15 minutes. Is that all right? Excellent. I want to move on to the topic of self-censorship and look at that a little bit more in depth. There's a question from Anthony Dapiran, who's of course a well-known lawyer and author in Hong Kong, who asks, he has sent us an exam question actually. Quote, there is no such thing as self-censorship, there is only censorship. Discuss. Right? There is actually no better person to discuss this than Francis, because if you go to the International Encyclopedia of Journalism Studies, published in 2019, you will find a 5-page entry on self-censorship, and it's written by Francis Lee. So I hope in less than 5 pages, can you tell us how to think about self-censorship?
Well, less than 5 pages is actually difficult. But I guess, in Hong Kong, well, especially when Chairman mentioned that small little piece in the kind of encyclopedic entry, I think when we talk about self-censorship in Hong Kong, one interesting thing or one important phenomenon that we have to think about is that self-censorship in Hong Kong is mainly an organizational phenomenon. Now, what I mean by organizational phenomenon is that if you compare Hong Kong with places like Colombia, places like some African countries, okay? Places like Colombia, African countries, I mean, the individual journalists can indeed get killed, get murdered, right? By drug tycoons, by gangsters, etc., right? Or by, military governments, etc. Now in Hong Kong, we're not like that. We're far from being like that. But of course, at the same time, in the past, 20, 25 years, we know that there have always been these talks about self-censorship. And all these self-censorship, tends to be, as I say, tends to be kind of an organizational product. Organizational product, goes back, in fact, if I need to get a little bit, academic, goes back to, in terms of some research we call social control within the newsroom. Okay, that is, when you work in a news organization, there are various kind of incentives, because you like the superior, you trust him or her, because you want to move up the ladder, you want to move ahead, etc., etc. And then, of course, in the organizations, there are various kinds of routines, there are various kinds of, how, the newsroom operates, etc., etc., that attempt to undermine, okay, the production of productive news stories. And I think, this, by the way, this is what my colleague, Alan Au, who wrote this book about press freedom, so-called, 20 shadows, under the Chinese shadows, right? And the Chinese shadows under a press review, in which he actually outlined a whole set of practices, a whole set of mechanisms through which self-censorship has become something structurally embedded into the operation of news organizations. So I think that is actually the thing about the most important thing about self-censorship in Hong Kong. Again, I mean, it also goes to another point I want to mention in relation to self-censorship is also is a matter of equilibrium. Okay, a matter of equilibrium even within news organizations, right? A matter of equilibrium in what sense? Now, back in 1993, okay, there was this very famous case of 6 mid-level journalists at ATV, Asia Television, resigned collectively and publicly because ATV refused to air a documentary about the Tiananmen incident. Okay, so there was a so-called okay, the 6 gentlemen from ATV. Now, this kind of incident, very publicly visible incident, is actually a sign that the news organization itself has not reached an equilibrium. So there is actually no way to resolve that or negotiate that differences, right? So people had to resign. Now, after the 1993 incident, the next time a major Hong Kong news organization had this kind of public outburst, okay, from collective outbursts by journalists, would already be 2014 during the Umbrella Movement, when close to 100 TVB journalists signed that public letter and criticized the news organization publicly about the handling of the police story. So basically, again, as I said, this is how self-censorship operated within the Hong Kong media. Most of the times, okay, it had, especially in the past 20-25 years, okay, most of the times it was operating as an kind of an organizational process. And most of the times when things have reached a certain degree of equilibrium, okay, then people just negotiated those differences, okay, with the result being, okay, well, very often with the result being undermining of critical reporting. And that's what we usually, as at least academics, what we usually call self-censorship. Yeah. But again, as I said, it's actually hard because the paradigm has changed. So it's actually, maybe even the politics of self-censorship, maybe even the phenomenon of self-censorship itself might also be changing.
You raise an important point about the organizational level, and it reminds me also that I think it's a myth that Hong Kong had a free press before 2020. In fact, Freedom House had downgraded Hong Kong's press freedom status to partly free as far back as 2008, mainly because of media owners had potentially compromising business interests in the mainland. And so this conflict of interest was, in the view of press freedom monitors, also already beginning to induce this kind of self-censorship within organizations. I mean, I think to answer Anthony's question, I think yes, I mean, there are a lot of censorship scholars, including myself, who would see self-censorship as a kind of induced or preemptive censorship. It's because of the exertion of some kind of external pressure by powerful forces that you make your calculations and decide, well, I'm not going to wait to be censored, I'm going to exercise self-restraint. Not because of professional judgment or ethical judgment, but simply to avoid inevitable punishment or to get rewards. Some even say that actually we should think of censorship as failed self-censorship. That self-censorship is in fact the holy grail of an authoritarian regime. If they have to censor, it's because they have failed to induce self-censorship. And that is certainly, I think, something interesting to think about in the Hong Kong context. We're going to have to come to our final round of questions, and I guess we should think about the future and also about what is it in the Hong Kong context that gives us hope, or at least will complicate things in positive and interesting ways. Yeah? Because we know, for example, that even within mainland China, people's demand for free media or to have a voice has not been completely extinguished, right? Which suggests that it's not, in fact, that easy to brainwash an entire population, no matter what the authorities want to do. Rose and Kinghua, if anything, to comment on what the Chinese experience tells us about the demand for independent media and for a voice among ordinary citizens.
Okay, so maybe today we have a lot of things that sound pretty depressing, but maybe we can talk about something. Look, what's something in China when we talk about we are still having a lot of regulation, normal regulation, but we can say that it's still not yet close to what is happening right now in China. So, for example, if you look at Tiananmen anniversary. So, until now, after 30 years, every year we still see people trying to find some way to negotiate through the censorship system to post something online, no matter just a candle or perhaps just a small something like a slogan. They've been trying to do something, even though it's really short life, usually within a minute or very short period of time, you got to remove it, but still people trying to find a way no matter what. So that means, back to the question, no matter how strong regulation in anywhere, in China, people, if they have a desire to express the view, it really virtually that no one single system can remove everything. Another good example during COVID. So a lot of people say, hey, before 2020, it already had the new regulation, cybersecurity law. There's a lot of crackdown of the regulated internet. But in February 2020, we see some kind of movement on Weibo. People try to make use of the death of the Li Wennan, the whistleblowers in the Wuhan hospital, to try to express their views that about how the regulation about the freedom of speech that would damage the society. Even there's some kind of online petitions. So I think if no matter what, we see all this kind of regulation, a lot of people just, CK just mentioned about, hey, this is some kind of unrest in China in 2019, but I think that basically this unrest now is not in the physical form, but still a lot of people still has a lot of grievances towards the government, and in many different aspects, democracy, human rights, and many others. So in the future, they still will find a way to express their view, even though not in a physical protest manner, but perhaps they will find other ways to say online. So they will continue to have this kind of clash with the regulation.
Rose?
I would say in mainland China, for some people say journalism is dying, but you can still witness a lot of people passionate with journalism, trying using different forms, which we might consider as not a journalistic work, but it's just because of the regulation, censorship, they're trying to using different forms to voice out. Which, for example, they're using soft storytelling, but tackling very serious issues and fighting the censorship. So, yeah, that's quite inspiring. And a lot of young people, especially young people, they're quite insistent doing that. For example, a lot of podcasts, which sounds like very entertainment, but if you listen to them very seriously, you will get a lot of information there. So Although in mainland China are heavily controlled, people are trying very hard by using different forms, by using creative ways, trying to on Weibo 里面那样 they just make comments continuously. That's also the way to show the resistance. In Hong Kong, I would say mainstream media definitely will be with the less critical mainstream media. It's just because of the micro level of the media system change, and also definitely we came to the organizational level. But Hong Kong still relatively free flow of free internet, and also we have a very strong civil society. So I talk to a lot of young independent journalists. So I do think they're the future. Small scale news media or community journalism and the independent journalists. But the thing is, they need the support from the public. So I'm not sure. I really think the media literacy education is so important because it's to support those kind of journalism. It's quite important for the future of Hong Kong.
Marco, what is your understanding of broader international trends? Tell us about the potential of the kind of resistance, alternative media, and so on that Rose is talking about.
One of the comparisons that we had in the past, maybe, I don't know, a few months or you could say almost a year, is, there's this narrative about the exodus from Hong Kong. That, foreigners are leaving Hong Kong, or local people are leaving Hong Kong, and indeed to some extent that is happening. But then when, for instance, international folks talk about where they're leaving to, and they mention something like, oh, I'm going to Dubai or something like that. Well, you're going for different reasons. So definitely not freedom of speech. So if you're competing with Dubai, I think we're winning. So, and not to say anything bad about Dubai, of course. But what I'm trying to say here is that one of the reasons why I think we still have somewhat bright future is the sheer amount of capital that surrounds us. For the first time in history of Hong Kong Stock Exchange, we have a non-Chinese stock exchange. And that's a symbolic, for sure, yes. I mean, there's definitely a reason why he's there. And that's probably the reason why the flow of information cannot be completely controlled or even attempted to control. Another reason is there is no one to benefit for full control. I don't see why, what would be a direct gain. If you say, let's have full control of Hong Kong right now, I cannot see really who would gain anything from it other than the fact that a lot of people will lose money on property and stock market and whatnot. At the same time, most of my colleagues and friends I have in China, I don't know a single person in China who does not have a VPN. Not a single person. I'm sure there are people who do not have a VPN, but I don't know any of those. Of course, very biased.
So you're probably the problem.
There's definitely, please mark my friend here. And they have it for very different reasons. Some have it because of Google Scholar. Okay, so very simple. They just eat their stuff. Some have it because they like watching entertainment content that's not available in China. So fundamentally, the flow of information is, I think, where we really need to focus on. I'm positive about the future. Let's say medium term, I think we are more or less okay, but it's not going to be going back to the old days. I think that those days are done. And it's great to probably start writing a book about history of Hong Kong. It's a great start, and I do encourage people who are in the know, please I'll buy a copy.
Edmund, do you want to take a crack at that? What are some of the silver linings or signs of hope that you see? What are sources of Hong Kong's resilience, if you want to put it that way?
Well, at least some of the stories and events that we discussed today are still being reported in most of the mainstream media. My students, actually, when I read some of these newspapers, they are very critical of me. But I mean, in the sense that, well, why you read this newspaper and that kind of thing? Because my students tends to be a little bit critical in a way. But I think that's the thing. Probably still a good sign that some professional standards are still being maintained. There's certain still openness. Okay, I mean, you don't need to get this kind of local news from the foreign media, right? And I think I agree with some of my panelists saying that, I mean, even in, actually my two co-author, we just published a special issue in China quarterly called Alternative Publication in China. And when a Harvard sociologist, she introduced the term contentious public sphere, right, about how new information technology changed the way that opinion are being expressed, even in China's context. Okay, and my Sebastian Webb, he wrote another book called Minjian, talking about grassroots society in China, how they will adapt to this kind of changing regulated environment. And probably we are not going to see, as Marco said, that kind of so-called civic society we define Hong Kong in the past, but there's still some room for negotiation, I would say, because of the way, there's still a lot of people demanding this, not only because of the business sector, but also the Hong Kong topic. But I would say, of course, it would be more conducive if the authorities or the professional sector can really discuss to come up with some clear guidelines in the future, right? And so that people are not second guessing and end up with the censorship or self-censorship debate. And that, of course, we'll wait and see.
Francis? Well, I guess
I would just add 2 points to what the other panelists already said. The first point is basically repeating what I said earlier. It's still very uncertain of what the new paradigm will be. And in one sense, it's also still uncertain of how far the government is going to go in constructing, restricting freedom in Hong Kong. There are still differences. If you look at, for example, just the past June 4th, of course it's banned, but if you compare Hong Kong and Macau, right? The Macau government is already, saying that, that is against national security, right? Whereas the Hong Kong government is still using the COVID-19, the pandemic, as the main reason. They publicly say, we cannot allow this because of a pandemic, instead of just directly saying that on June 4th or the alliance is outlawed. Now, of course, no one would rule out the possibility that the association might be outlawed soon. We don't know, but at least you see, the government still kind of testing the water, so to speak. So it's still, I do have to say, it's still uncertain that how far they will really go. And secondly, to just echo the point about and I would just borrow I and Edmund also doing research, a lot of research on social movements, and I would also borrow a concept from social movement studies, abeyance, movement abeyance. Basically, the idea of abeyance in social movement studies is that social protest movements go up and down. There are cycles. Sometimes you have the peak of mobilization. Sometimes the environment becomes so hostile, so bad, that the movement just need to lay low, just need to stay put and try to preserve itself. It's not even resistance, just to try to preserve itself, to turn inward, to try to engage in different efforts to retain your network, retain your values, retain your principle, retain your beliefs, retain your identity, so on and so forth, just to survive the hostile environment, to retain itself, to wait for the next time when the environment becomes more conducive to the call for progressive social change. So I think in one sense you can also think about the development of journalism or the trajectory of journalism in this way, right? Hong Kong, no matter what, we have had a period of time, especially since the early 1980s, we had a period of time when the environment was more conducive, relatively speaking, much more conducive to the practice of the kind of journalism that we learned from the liberal tradition. Okay, of course it was not perfect, we know that, as Jeremy mentioned, but there was an environment which used to be much more conducive. Now the environment is seemingly apparently very hostile to that. And in one sense we can avoid that. We cannot easily change the environment by ourselves. But at least the professional community, including educators of professional journalism, can do is to find ways to survive this period, find ways to retain our network, to retain our identity, and to preserve our beliefs. And I think we do have, enough ground, no matter we are talking about educational institutions, researchers, professional journalists, civil society actors, to actually, can cooperate with each other to do this work of preservation. So I think that's the point I want to add here.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Francis. Well, we have broken our promise about timekeeping. We have extended far beyond 1.5 hours. It's 2 hours now. But on the bright side, I have kept my promise that we would not be able to answer the question, is there media freedom post-NSL? We have not been able to answer the question, and I'm glad that my panelists cooperated and didn't cop out with very simplistic answers. Right? There's actually a very good reason for this, I think, which is that that kind of yes/no answer only makes sense if you're happy with a very low resolution picture of a country or society from a far distance. Then yes, you can come up with crude categories. But I think that the closer you are to the situation, the more you demand a very high resolution picture. And when you have a high resolution image, no, it doesn't work out as simple as a yes or no answer. And of course, all of us on this panel are not distant, removed, disinterested observers of Hong Kong media and politics. Right? We have a vested interest in how things play out. As journalism schools, we treat, I think we're teaching the gold standard of professional journalism. Journalism as a public service, rising above ego, rising above individual self-interest, always trying to be independent of political and business power. That's what we teach, that's what we care about in what seems like a distant time. That was almost guaranteed in the Hong Kong context. Now, of course, it is no longer guaranteed, far from it. But we do not think it is impossible or worth giving up on. But like so many other societies around the world that are kind of semi-free and semi-closed, if we do it, it will be kind of within the cracks very creatively. It will be finding the gaps. And this requires, of course, a lot more political judgment, a lot more calculated risk-taking, a lot more in-depth knowledge of the political environment. And I think that's what we have tried to provide to ourselves in conversation as well as to our audience. I couldn't agree more with Francis's point about needing to come together as communities who care about Hong Kong and what makes it special, to keep these conversations going, remind ourselves what we're trying to preserve, even in what seems like very inauspicious times. And I think this has been, part of that conversation. It will not be the last one. We should do this again every year. So with that, I just want to thank, on behalf of Janet, thank you all for being with us, and I hope you found it productive. Thank you especially to our 5 speakers. Thank you.